The GPS signal died with a final, despairing beep. The screen flashed, signal lost over a map that had slowly dissolved into a featureless green void. Leo cursed under his breath, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel of his sedan. He was a man who lived by schedules and algorithms, a software engineer whose world was built on the bedrock of binary certainty. This, the creeping wilderness, the failing technology, was an affront to his very nature. He'd booked the Airbnb on a whim, a desperate attempt to break the monotony of his life. The Miller Retreat, the listing had called it, a historic cabin for those seeking solitude and inspiration. Disconnect to reconnect. The photos showed a charming, if slightly worn, 2-story log cabin nestled in a serene grove of pines. The price was unbelievably low. Now, navigating by a hastily scribbled note and the position of the sinking sun, Leo understood why. After another 20 minutes of navigating winding, poorly paved roads, he found it. A rusty mailbox, tilting like a drunkard, bore the faded number 13. The gravel driveway beyond was long and canopied by skeletal trees that clawed at the gray sky. The first thing that struck him was the cold. It was a damp, invasive chill that seeped through his jacket the moment he stepped out of the car. A cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It felt personal. The second thing was the silence. It was absolute, a thick blanket smothering the usual sounds of nature. No birds, no insects, nothing. He was hauling his laptop bag and suitcase from the trunk when a movement at the edge of the tree line caught his eye. An old man stood there, gaunt and weathered, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. His eyes, pale and milky, were fixed on Leo. "You the one for the Miller place?" the man called, his voice a dry rasp, like leaves skittering over stone. Leo forced a smile, the one he used for difficult clients. "That's me, Leo. You from around here?" The man didn't answer the question. He shuffled closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. He smelled of soil and old sweat. "Place has a history," he said, his gaze drifting past Leo to the cabin. "Folks around here, we got a name for it. The Weeping House." Leo chuckled, a tight, nervous sound. "Sounds dramatic. Let me guess. On a full moon, you can hear a ghostly lament." The old man's eyes snapped back to him, and there was no humor in them, only a deep, weary pity that made Leo's skin crawl. "Ain't about the moon, son. It's about the loneliness. Sarah Miller, she gets lonely, and she has a way of making sure her guests stay for the conversation." "Sarah Miller?" Leo asked, his curiosity momentarily overriding his unease. "The last Miller to live there. Died there too. A long time ago." The old man pointed a bony finger at the house. "She loved that house more than she ever loved a living soul. She fills it with her grief. It soaks the walls, the floors. It pools in the corners. You seem like a smart fella, a city fella. My advice? Sleep in your car, or better yet, drive and don't look back." With that, he turned and melted back into the woods, leaving Leo standing alone in the creeping dusk, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. Superstitious old fool, he thought, but the thought lacked conviction. He turned to face the cabin. It was larger than the photos suggested and more dilapidated. The logs were dark with moisture, and the windows looked like vacant black eyes. The front door was heavy oak, scarred and weathered. He found the key under a false rock, just as the host's email had instructed. The key turned with a loud, grating clunk. He pushed the door open. The wave of cold that hit him was so sudden and so intense it stole his breath. A visible plume of mist puffed from his lips. It was at least 20 degrees colder inside than out. Drafts, his mind insisted, a frantic, rational plea. Old houses are full of drafts. The air inside was thick and carried a scent he couldn't quite place. A mix of dust, old wood, and beneath it, something cloyingly sweet, like rotten lilies. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous silence. There was no response, only the settling groan of the house itself. He stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. The click of the latch was final, like the sealing of a tomb. The living room was a museum of neglect. Faded floral wallpaper peeled away from the walls in long, curling strips. The furniture was heavy, dark, and upholstered in scratchy, antique fabric. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth black and cold. On the mantelpiece, a single object stood out: a tarnished silver frame holding a photograph of a severe-looking woman. She had sharp features, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes were dark, piercing pools. She wore a high-collared black dress. Her mouth was a thin, unforgiving line. Sarah Miller, he presumed. Her gaze was so intense, it felt like a physical pressure. Shaking off the feeling, Leo decided to explore. The kitchen was a relic, with a chipped enamel sink and an ancient gas-powered refrigerator that hummed with a weary, rattling vibration. A door off the kitchen led to the basement. It was bolted shut with a heavy, iron latch. Probably infested with animals, he reasoned. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms. The master bedroom held a massive 4-poster bed with a canopy thick with dust motes. He dropped his bags here. On the nightstand, identical to the one downstairs, was another photograph of Sarah Miller. This one was a closer shot, and her expression seemed even more disapproving, as if she resented his intrusion into her private space. He tried to connect to the Wi-Fi. The listing had promised high-speed internet. He found the network, Miller_guest. The password, according to the host, was Welcome 1. He connected, but the signal was a ghost, one bar that flickered in and out. He couldn't load a single web page. His phone signal was no better. He was truly cut off. As dusk deepened into night, Leo lit a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames providing a small, defiant pocket of warmth and light against the oppressive cold and silence. He ate a simple dinner from his provisions and tried to read a book on his laptop, but his mind kept wandering back to the old man's words. The weeping house. It was then that he heard the first noise that couldn't be easily explained. It was a soft, wet sound, a dragging, like something heavy and damp being pulled across the floorboards upstairs. He froze, his finger poised over the keyboard. The sound stopped. He held his breath, ears straining. Nothing. The house is settling. It's an old house. It's the wind. He tried to go back to his book, but the silence felt different now. It felt watchful. Hours later, jolted from a shallow, fitful sleep, he heard it again. This time, it was in the hallway outside his bedroom door. A slow, deliberate thump, drag, thump, drag. His heart hammered against his ribs. He lay paralyzed, the blankets pulled up to his chin like a frightened child. The sound reached his door and stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was a listening silence. Then came a new sound. Fingernails. Long, delicate fingernails, gently scratching at the bottom of the wooden door. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was a patient, almost curious sound. "Who's there?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling. The scratching stopped instantly. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He lay there, staring at the sliver of darkness under the door, waiting for it to start again. It never did. But as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the grimy windows, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, on the dusty floorboards just outside his door, was a single, wet, muddy footprint. It was small, delicate, a woman's footprint, and it was pointed directly into his room. The rational part of Leo's brain, the part that debugged code and built logical systems, was screaming at him. There were explanations. There were always explanations. The dragging sound? A loose branch scraping the roof. The scratching? A rodent in the walls. The footprint? He must have tracked it in himself, and his mind, spooked by the old man's story, had misinterpreted it. But the footprint was small. Too small for his size 11 shoes. And it was fresh. He spent the morning in a state of high alert, his nerves frayed. The house seemed to watch him. The eyes of Sarah Miller in the photographs seemed to follow him from room to room. The cold was a constant presence, a chill that the weak sun and the rekindled fire couldn't dispel. He decided to do what any logical person would do: investigate. If he could find a rational cause for the phenomena, he could dismantle the fear, piece by piece. He started upstairs, examining the hallway where he'd heard the dragging. The floorboards were dusty, but aside from the one terrifying footprint, which had now dried into a faint stain, there were no other marks. He peered into the second bedroom. It was sparsely furnished with a single bed and a dresser. It felt empty, devoid of the oppressive presence that saturated the master bedroom. It was in this room that he found the first real clue. Tucked behind the dresser, as if it had fallen and been forgotten, was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was stiff with age, and the pages were brittle and yellowed. His heart thudding with a mixture of trepidation and excitement, Leo took it downstairs and sat by the fire. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, but spidery and frantic in places. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1898. Father is gone. The consumption took him in the night. The house is so quiet now, so large. It is just Mother and I. She has not spoken since the funeral. She simply sits in her chair by the window, staring out at the woods. She looks at me sometimes, and I do not see my mother in her eyes. I see a stranger, a resentful stranger. The journal belonged to Eleanor Miller, Sarah's daughter. Leo read on, his own surroundings fading away as he was drawn into a tragedy a century old. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a life of stifling isolation. Sarah Miller, widowed and bitter, had become a recluse, her grief curdling into a possessive, smothering love for her only daughter and the house that was her sole inheritance. October 29th, 1898. She has forbidden me from going into town. She says the people are gossips, that they look at us with pity. She says we have everything we need right here. We are self-sufficient. We are Millers. But I am so lonely. I hear the laughter of young people from the road sometimes, and it feels like a physical pain. Asterisk. November 3rd, 1898. A young man came to the door today, a traveler. His carriage had lost a wheel. He was handsome, with kind eyes. Mother sent him away with a curse on her lips. When I protested, she struck me. She said I was becoming a harlot, that my thoughts were impure. She said this house would protect me from the corruption of the world. She said we would be together here, forever. Leo's skin crawled. The narrative was a slow, chilling descent into madness. Sarah's madness. The house wasn't just a building. It was a character in this tragedy, a gilded cage. He flipped forward, his fingers trembling. The entries became more sporadic, more desperate. December 24th, 1898. It is Christmas Eve. There is no celebration, no tree, no light. Mother caught me trying to write a letter to my aunt. She burned it in the fireplace. She held my hand over the flames until I screamed. "The outside world will only burn you, my dear," she said. "I am your only salvation. This house is your only sanctuary. The smell of my own scorched skin. I will never forget it." January 15th, 1899. I can no longer distinguish her love from her hatred. They are one and the same. A cold, suffocating blanket. I have begun to hear her crying at night. A low, hopeless sound that seems to come from the walls themselves. But when I go to her room, she is asleep, or pretending to be. Is it her, or is it the house, weeping with us? The final entry was dated February 2nd, 1899. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl. She has locked me in my room. The basement. She has been down there for days. I hear her digging. She says she is building a new room, a safe room, where we can be together without any chance of interruption, forever. She sings to herself an old lullaby, but the words are wrong. They are vile. I am so cold, so tired. I hear scratching at the door. Is it her? Or is it something else? Something that has always lived here, waiting. God help me. I think the house is... The entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Leo sat back, his breath shallow. The journal fell from his numb fingers onto the floor. He looked around the living room, and it was no longer just a dusty old room. It was a crime scene. Sarah Miller's grief and madness hadn't just been emotional. They had been a physical force, a poison that had seeped into the very foundations. He now understood the source of the haunting. But understanding did not bring comfort. It only made the presence in the house feel more solid, more viciously intentional. His investigation had not dispelled the fear. It had given it a name, a face, and a terrible, tragic history. Sarah Miller wasn't just a ghost. She was a warden, and he was her new prisoner. The daylight outside was already beginning to wane, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The cold seemed to intensify, coiling around him. He was no longer a skeptic. He was a believer, and he was terrified. The journal had broken Leo. The logical frameworks he relied on had collapsed, revealing a horrifying truth beneath. The world was not always rational, and some horrors were beyond debugging. The fear was now a cold, heavy stone in his gut, a constant companion. As night fell, he fortified his position. He dragged a heavy armchair in front of the bedroom door and placed a glass of water on the floor in front of it, a primitive alarm system. He kept the fire roaring, its light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. But the shadows it cast seemed alive, twitching and dancing with malicious intent. He must have dozed off, because he was jolted awake by a sound that was not part of his nightmares. It was a loud bang from downstairs, followed by the tinkling of shattered glass. His heart leapt into his throat. He waited, listening. Silence. Then, a slow, dragging sound from the ground floor. It was heavier this time, more deliberate than the night before. Thump. Drag. Thump. Drag. It was moving through the living room. Then, it started up the stairs. Each step was a laborious, wet-sounding ordeal. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Leo scrambled out of bed, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. The glass of water remained undisturbed. The sound reached the top of the stairs and moved into the hallway. It was right outside his door. The scratching began again, but it was no longer gentle. It was frantic, desperate, like an animal trying to claw its way out of a trap. Scritch, scratch, scritch. Then it stopped. The dragging sound moved away, back down the hall. But it didn't go downstairs. It entered the second bedroom, Eleanor's room. Tea. A new sound began. A soft, feminine weeping. It was the sound he'd been warned about. The weeping house was living up to its name. But this crying was different from Sarah's imagined sobs in the journal. It was younger, filled with a fresher, more acute terror. It was Eleanor. The crying went on for what felt like an hour, a heartbreaking serenade of despair. Then, as suddenly as it started, it ceased. The silence that followed was profound, and somehow worse. It was the silence of a concluded action. Leo didn't move until the first gray light of dawn illuminated the windows. His body was stiff with tension and cold. He moved the chair and opened the door cautiously. The hallway was empty. The glass was untouched. He descended the stairs, each step a conscious act of will. The living room was a mess. The photograph of Sarah Miller lay face down on the floor, its glass shattered. The other objects on the mantel were undisturbed. This was a message, a display of power. He knew then that he couldn't stay. The rational course of action was to leave immediately. He would pack his things, get in his car, and drive. He could deal with the host and the lost money later. His sanity was worth more. He ran upstairs and threw his belongings into his suitcase. He zipped it up and turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob. It wouldn't turn. He jiggled it. Nothing. The knob was locked. But it was a simple, interior door lock, one that could only be engaged with a key from the outside, or by the little button in the center. He hadn't pressed the button. He looked. The button was depressed. A cold dread, separate from the ambient chill of the house, washed over him. He was locked in. Okay, don't panic, he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. He looked around for something to pry the door open. There was nothing. The windows? He rushed to one and looked out. The drop to the ground was a good 20 feet onto sharp, jagged rocks. A suicidal jump. He was trapped, just like Eleanor. A new sound started then, from downstairs. A low, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from the basement. Driven by a desperate, furious energy, Leo began to throw his shoulder against the bedroom door. The old wood groaned but held. He kicked at the area around the knob. On the fifth kick, with a splintering crack, the door jamb gave way, and the door swung open. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his suitcase and laptop bag and bolted down the stairs, heading for the front door. He grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled. It didn't move. He pulled again, putting his full weight into it. Nothing. The deadbolt was thrown. He hadn't locked it. He fumbled with the bolt, but it was rusted shut, immovable. He was sealed inside. The thumping from the basement grew louder, more insistent. It was a summoning. Terror and rage warred within him. He was a prisoner. Sarah Miller would not let him leave. This was her design. His eyes fell on the heavy iron latch securing the basement door. If he was going to be trapped, he would find out what was down there. He would meet his captor. With a defiant roar, he unbolted the basement door. It swung inward on its own, revealing a steep flight of wooden stairs, descending into a palpable darkness. The smell that wafted up was foul, wet earth, rot, and that same sweet, decaying floral scent, now overpowering. He found a flashlight on a shelf, an old, heavy metal one. He clicked it on. The beam was weak, but it was light. He took a deep breath and started down. The stairs groaned under his weight. The basement was a low-ceilinged, sprawling space, a root cellar filled with the detritus of a century. Jars of unidentifiable, shriveled things lined dusty shelves. Old furniture was shrouded in filthy white sheets, looking like a congregation of ghosts. The thumping was coming from the far corner. He swept his light in that direction. There, partially concealed behind a stack of crumbling boxes, was a door. A small, heavy-looking door, reinforced with iron bands. It was unlike any other door in the house. It looked like the door to a vault or a cell. The thumping was coming from behind it, Thump, thump, thump. This was it, the source, the safe room Sarah had written about in the journal. His flashlight beam flickered. The batteries were dying. In the strobing light, he saw something etched into the wood of the door. He stepped closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a word, carved with savage, deep gouges. Mine. The thumping stopped. The silence was deafening. And then, from directly behind him, so close he could feel the cold radiating from it, a voice whispered into his ear. It was a dry, ancient sound, the rustle of a grave shroud, layered with the faint, desperate sobbing of a young girl. You are home. The flashlight died. In the absolute, suffocating darkness, Leo screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled backward, tripping over a crate and landing hard on the damp earthen floor. The smell of decay filled his nostrils, thick and choking. The voice was gone, but the presence was not. He could feel it all around him, a coalescing malice in the dark. The cold was so intense, it felt like needles piercing his skin. The faint sobbing of Eleanor echoed from the corners of the basement, a pathetic counterpoint to the silent, predatory rage of her mother. Scrambling on his hands and knees, his mind shattering, Leo knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had to get out of the basement. He had to get to that reinforced door. It was the heart of the horror, and if he could breach it, perhaps he could break the cycle. His flailing hands found the dead flashlight. He shook it violently, and for a glorious second, the beam flickered back to life, stuttering and weak. He swept it around. The shrouded furniture seemed to have moved, the sheets now outlining shapes that were too tall, too thin to be chairs. He focused on the reinforced door. There was no visible lock, just heavy iron hinges and the banding. He got to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and threw himself against it. It didn't budge. It was like hitting a stone wall. He slammed his shoulder into it again and again, a desperate, frantic rhythm. "Let me out," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Let me out!" On the fifth impact, something gave. Not the door, but the wood around the top hinge, rotten from a century of dampness, splintered. A crack appeared. A wind howled through the basement, a frigid gust that had no source. It tore the white sheets from the furniture, sending them swirling through the air like angry phantoms. The sobbing of Eleanor rose to a terrified wail. Leo ignored it. He saw his chance. He focused his efforts on the cracked area, kicking and pounding at it. Pieces of wood began to break away. He could see darkness through the gap. A different kind of darkness, utterly lightless and void. With a final, brutal kick, the top hinge tore completely free, and the door sagged inwards, revealing a black opening just large enough to squeeze through. The wind died instantly. The sobbing stopped. The basement was plunged into an unnerving, watchful silence. The only sound was Leo's ragged, panicked breathing. He pointed the dying flashlight into the opening. The beam penetrated a few feet into a small, cramped space. no larger than a closet. The floor was bare earth, and in the center of the floor, curled in a fetal position, was a skeleton. It was small and delicate, still dressed in the tattered remains of a high-collared Victorian dress. A locket, tarnished black, was clutched in one bony hand. Eleanor Miller. She hadn't been locked in her bedroom. She had been walled up alive in this safe room by her mother, a final, monstrous act of possession. But that wasn't what made Leo's mind finally break. The beam of his flashlight, flickering on its last legs, drifted to the wall opposite the skeleton. The earthen wall was covered in scratches, thousands upon thousands of them, covering every inch from floor to ceiling. They weren't random. They were words, carved and recarved, with fingernails that had been worn down to the quick, written in a frantic, hopeless script. I'm sorry. Let me out. Mother, please. I love you. I hate you. It's so cold. The house is hungry. It's in the walls. It's in my head. It won't let me go. It won't let me go. It won't let me go. And, carved largest of all, directly in the center, a single stark declaration. I am the weeping house. The truth crashed down on him with the weight of the earth above. Sarah Miller's madness had been so powerful, her possessive love so twisted, that it hadn't just haunted the house, it had become the house. Eleanor hadn't just died in the darkness. Her terror, her despair, her final agonizing moments had been absorbed, becoming part of the very entity her mother had created. The weeping house wasn't just a name, it was a consciousness, a composite being of Sarah's malignant love and Eleanor's eternal suffering. It didn't have a ghost. It was the ghost.